in the harsh winter of 1873, when survival meant choosing between dignity and death. A starving young woman named Sarah McKenna made a choice that would forever change her understanding of justice, mercy, and the true meaning of humanity. What began as a desperate grab for a loaf of bread in a hostile frontier town would lead her into the darkest depths of human cruelty, only to discover that salvation sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. The bitter wind cut through Sarah McKenna's threadbare shawl like a knife as she pressed herself against the wooden wall of Henderson's general store. Her stomach had stopped growling 3 days ago, replaced now by a hollow ache that seemed to echo in her bones. Through the frost-covered window, she could see the golden loaves of bread lined up on the counter like small treasures, their crusts still warm from the morning bake. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to summon courage she wasn't sure she possessed. At 19, she had already survived more hardship than many twice her age. The fever that took her parents the previous spring had left her alone in the world, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a determination to survive that was now wearing thin. The town of Cedar Ridge, Montana Territory, was not kind to strangers, especially young women with no family or means of support. Sarah had tried everything honest work could offer. She had knocked on every door, begged at every establishment, offered to scrub floors, tend children, or mend clothes. But winter had been cruel, and jobs were scarce even for those with connections and references. For a homeless orphan with no one to vouch for her character, the doors remained firmly closed. She had been living in an abandoned shed on the outskirts of town for the past month, surviving on scraps and whatever edible roots she could find beneath the snow. But the cold was getting worse, and her body was growing weaker by the day. She knew that without food soon, she would not see another week. The bell above the store's door chimed as Mrs. Henderson emerged, a large woman with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a thick wool coat and carried herself with the authority of someone who had never known true want. Sarah watched as she locked the door behind her and hurried down the street toward the church, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. This was Sarah's chance, perhaps her only chance. She had noticed earlier that the back window of the store had a loose latch, likely damaged by the recent storms. It would be wrong, she knew that. She had been raised to be honest, to work for what she needed. But her parents were dead, and their moral lessons seemed like luxuries she could no longer afford. Sarah crept around to the back of the building, her feet crunching softly in the snow. The window was indeed loose, and after a few careful manipulations, she managed to work it open just wide enough to slip through. The store was warm inside, filled with the mingled scents of coffee, tobacco, and fresh bread that made her mouth water and her head spin. She moved quickly toward the counter where the bread was displayed, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the whole town could hear it. She reached for the smallest loaf, reasoning that it might not be missed as quickly as a larger one. Her fingers had just closed around the warm crust when she heard the jingle of keys at the front door. Terror flooded through her as she realized Mrs. Henderson had returned much sooner than expected. There was no time to escape through the window, no place to hide the evidence of her crime. The bread was still in her hands when the door swung open and Mrs. Henderson stepped inside, stopping short when she saw the ragged young woman standing behind her counter. For a moment, neither woman moved. Sarah's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. What could she possibly say to explain herself? Mrs. Henderson's face went through a series of expressions, from surprise to understanding to righteous anger. "Thief," Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the silence like a whip. "You dirty little thief! How dare you break into my store?" Sarah dropped the bread and held up her hands in a gesture of surrender. "Please, ma'am, I can explain. I was just so hungry, and I thought maybe." "I don't want to hear your excuses." Mrs. Henderson backed toward the door, never taking her eyes off Sarah. "Henry, Henry, come quick. We've got a thief in the store." Her shouts echoed down the street, and within moments, Sarah could hear the sound of running feet on the wooden boardwalk. She looked desperately toward the back window, but she knew it was too late. There would be no escape now. Henry Henderson burst through the door first, a stocky man with work-hardened hands and suspicious eyes. Behind him came several other men from the town, drawn by his wife's cries. They filled the doorway, blocking any hope of escape Sarah might have harbored. "Caught her red-handed," Mrs. Henderson announced, pointing an accusatory finger at Sarah. "Broke in through the back window and was stealing our bread." The men looked at Sarah with a mixture of disgust and anger that made her take a step backward. She recognized some of them, men whose doors she had knocked on seeking work, who had turned her away without a second glance. Now they looked at her as if she were something they might scrape off their boots. "Please," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what I did was wrong, but I haven't eaten in days. I was desperate." "Desperation don't excuse stealing," said Tom Crawford, the town's self-appointed leader in such matters. He was a tall, lean man with pale eyes that seemed to look right through people. "We can't have vagrants and thieves thinking they can just take what they want from honest folks." "What should we do with her?" asked another man. "Send word to the territorial marshal." Crawford shook his head. "Marshal's 3 days' ride from here, and winter's getting worse. We can't spare men to make that trip, and we sure as hell can't feed and house a thief until spring." The men murmured their agreement, and Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. There was something in their voices, a hardness that spoke of men who had made difficult decisions before and would make them again. "In the old days, we knew how to deal with thieves," Crawford continued, his voice taking on a tone that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Made sure they didn't trouble honest folks again." "Now, Tom," Henry Henderson said, though there was no real conviction in his voice, "we're civilized people, we can't just—" "Can't just what?" Crawford interrupted. "Let her steal from us and then move on to the next town to do the same. She's already broken into one store. How long before she's robbing houses, maybe hurting someone in the process?" Sarah wanted to protest, to tell them that she would never hurt anyone, that this was the first and only time she had ever stolen anything. But the words stuck in her throat as she saw the expressions on their faces. They had already made up their minds about who she was and what she deserved. "The Indians used to have a way of marking thieves," said Jake Morrison, a grizzled man with scars on his hands from years of ranch work. "Made sure everyone knew what they were dealing with." "That's barbaric," Mrs. Henderson said, though her voice lacked conviction. "We're Christians here." "Are we?" Crawford asked. "Christians who let thieves run wild among us, Christians who don't protect what we've worked hard to build." He looked around at the other men, seeing agreement in their faces. "Sometimes Christian charity has to be balanced with Christian justice." Sarah felt her legs begin to shake as she realized what they were discussing. She had heard stories, whispered tales from other drifters and outcasts about frontier justice and what happened to those who crossed the wrong people in the wrong towns. But she had never imagined she would find herself on the receiving end of such treatment. "Please," she said again, her voice stronger now despite her fear. "I'll leave town. I'll never come back. I promise I won't steal again." "Promises from a thief," Crawford said with a snort. "What good are those?" The debate continued around her as if she weren't even there. Some of the men seemed uncomfortable with what was being suggested, but none of them spoke up strongly enough to stop it. They talked about examples and lessons, about protecting their families and their property. They talked about justice and necessity and the harsh realities of frontier life. But they didn't talk about mercy. They didn't talk about the fact that Sarah was barely more than a girl, alone and desperate in a world that had shown her nothing but hardship. They didn't talk about what might have driven her to such extremes or what alternatives she might have had. Finally, Crawford raised his hand for silence. "It's decided then," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We'll give her a taste of old-fashioned justice. Make sure she remembers this lesson, and make sure anyone else thinking of stealing from us remembers it too." Sarah's legs finally gave out, and she sank to her knees on the wooden floor of the store. The bread she had tried to steal lay beside her, forgotten now in the face of what was coming. She thought of her parents, of the values they had tried to instill in her, of the life she had hoped to build for herself. But those dreams seemed very far away now as the men began to discuss the details of her punishment. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but even God seemed distant in that cold, unforgiving place. The sound of their voices discussing her fate filled her ears like the buzzing of angry wasps. She heard words like tar and feathers and example, but they seemed to come from very far away. Her mind retreated to a place where she was still a child, safe in her mother's arms, listening to gentle lullabies instead of the harsh voices planning her humiliation. When she opened her eyes again, the men were looking down at her with expressions that ranged from satisfaction to uncertainty. Crawford seemed the most pleased, as if he were savoring the power he held over her fate. Others looked less comfortable, but none of them seemed willing to challenge his authority. "Get her up," Crawford said. We've got work to do." Rough hands grabbed Sarah's arms and hauled her to her feet. She tried to summon some dignity, some remnant of the pride her parents had taught her to carry, but it was difficult when surrounded by men who looked at her as if she were less than human. As they marched her out of the store and into the cold street, Sarah caught glimpses of faces in windows, people who had emerged from their homes and businesses to see what the commotion was about. Some looked curious, others appeared troubled, but none made any move to intervene. She was entirely alone in a world that had judged her and found her wanting. The punishment they had planned would mark her in ways that would never fully heal, but perhaps worse than the physical pain would be the knowledge that, when she had needed compassion most, she had found only cruelty. The men led her toward the center of town, where a crowd was beginning to gather. Word had spread quickly through the small community, and people emerged from their homes and shops to witness what was about to unfold. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the ground, unable to bear the sight of faces that showed curiosity and anticipation rather than sympathy or outrage. As they reached the town square, Crawford called out in a voice that carried clearly in the cold air, "Let this be a lesson to any who think they can take what doesn't belong to them. In Cedar Ridge, we protect what's ours, and we don't forget those who wrong us." The crowd murmured its approval, and Sarah realized that this was as much about the town's identity as it was about her crime. They were defining themselves as much by how they dealt with outsiders as by how they treated their own. And she, a friendless girl with no one to speak for her, was the perfect victim for their demonstration of righteous anger. The preparations began with methodical efficiency that spoke of men who had done similar things before, or at least had thought about doing them. Sarah watched in growing horror as they gathered the materials for her punishment, each item a small step toward a humiliation that would mark her forever. But even as fear consumed her, a small part of Sarah's mind remained clear and defiant. They could tar and feather her body, but they could not touch the part of her that remained essentially herself. She would survive this, just as she had survived everything else life had thrown at her. She had to survive it, because somewhere beyond this cruel town and its harsh justice, there had to be a place where mercy still existed, where a desperate act born of hunger could be met with understanding rather than vengeance. She would find that place, no matter what it took. The wind picked up, swirling snow around the gathered crowd, and Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders one last time before they took even that small comfort away from her. The fire they built in the center of the town square crackled and hissed as they heated the tar in an old iron kettle. Sarah watched the black substance bubble and steam, knowing that in minutes it would be coating her skin. The smell filled her nostrils, thick and acrid, mixing with the wood smoke and the cold mountain air. Tom Crawford supervised the preparations with the attention of a man organizing an important community event. He had sent boys running to gather feathers from the chicken coops behind the houses, and they returned with burlap sacks full of white and brown plumes that would soon transform her into a living scarecrow. "Strip her down to her shift," Crawford ordered, and Sarah felt hands grabbing at her clothes. She tried to pull away, but there were too many of them, and her strength had been sapped by days without food. "Please," she whispered as they tore away her dress, her shoes, her stockings. "Please don't do this." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The crowd had grown larger, and she could see children among them, wide-eyed and excited as if they were watching a carnival show. Women stood beside their husbands, some covering their mouths in shock, others nodding in approval. No one stepped forward to stop what was happening. The cold bit into her exposed skin like teeth, and she shivered violently as they bound her hands behind her back. They had left her in nothing but her thin cotton shift, and she could feel every eye in the crowd examining her vulnerability. Crawford tested the temperature of the tar with a long wooden paddle, nodding with satisfaction as it dripped black and thick. "Hot enough to stick, not hot enough to kill," he announced, as if this demonstrated some kind of mercy on his part. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to transport herself somewhere else, anywhere else. She thought of summer days when she was a child, running through fields of wildflowers with her mother calling after her to be careful. She thought of her father's gentle hands braiding her hair by lamplight, telling her stories of brave princesses and noble knights. But the fantasy shattered when the first ladleful of tar hit her shoulders. The heat was incredible, burning her skin even as it began to cool and harden. She screamed, unable to help herself, and the sound echoed off the buildings around the square. They worked systematically, these men who had judged her and found her wanting. The tar went on first, coating her arms, her back, her legs. It pulled at her skin as it cooled, creating a shell that cracked when she moved. Then came the feathers, stuck into the tar while it was still warm enough to hold them. Sarah had stopped screaming, partly because her throat was raw and partly because she realized it only seemed to encourage them. Instead, she bit down on her lip until she tasted blood and tried to focus on staying conscious. Fainting would be a mercy she wasn't sure she deserved. The transformation was grotesque and complete. When they were finished, she looked like some kind of mythical creature, part human and part bird, covered from head to toe in black tar and white feathers. The crowd laughed and pointed, some throwing bits of food and small stones. "Let this be a warning," Crawford announced, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "This is what happens to thieves in Cedar Ridge, remember it well." They untied her hands but left her standing there in the center of the square, a living monument to their idea of justice. People began to drift away, satisfied that they had seen something memorable, something they could talk about for months to come. Sarah stood as still as she could, afraid that moving would crack the tar and cause more pain. But as the crowd thinned and the sun began to set, she realized she couldn't stay there all night. The temperature was dropping, and despite the layer of tar, she could feel the cold seeping into her bones. She took a tentative step, then another. The tar had hardened enough that it held together, though she could feel it pulling at her skin with every movement. Someone in the dispersing crowd threw a rotten apple that hit her in the shoulder, and she stumbled but didn't fall. "Get out of town," Crawford called after her. "And don't come back, next time we might not be so merciful." Merciful? Sarah almost laughed at the word, but she didn't have the strength. Instead, she began walking toward the edge of town, each step a small agony as the tar cracked and shifted against her skin. The people who remained watched her go with a mixture of satisfaction and discomfort. Some seemed to be having second thoughts about what they had witnessed, but none spoke up to offer help or express regret. She was alone with her pain and humiliation, just as she had been alone with her hunger. At the edge of town, she paused to look back at Cedar Ridge. The lights in the windows looked warm and inviting, smoke rising from chimneys into the darkening sky. It looked like the kind of place where families gathered around dinner tables, where children were tucked into warm beds, where people helped their neighbors in times of trouble. But she knew now that appearances could be deceiving. Behind those welcoming facades lived people who could watch a desperate girl be tortured for the crime of trying to survive. She turned her back on the town and walked into the wilderness, not knowing where she was going or how she would survive. The forest was dark and full of sounds that made her jump despite her exhaustion. Every branch that cracked, every owl that hooted, every rustle in the underbrush could be a predator drawn by her scent. She was weak, injured, and covered in a substance that made her an easy target for any animal hungry enough to investigate. But she kept walking, driven by an instinct for survival that had kept her alive through the loss of her parents and months of hardship. The tar made movement difficult, cracking and pulling with every step, but it also provided a kind of armor against the cold. Her feet, bare except for the feathers stuck to them, quickly grew numb, but she forced herself to keep moving. She had no destination in mind, only the need to get as far away from Cedar Ridge as possible. The punishment had been designed to mark her permanently, to make her instantly recognizable as a thief wherever she went. But maybe, if she could get far enough away, she could find people who had never heard of Cedar Ridge and its particular brand of justice. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time became meaningless as she stumbled through the forest, following deer trails and dried creek beds. She drank from a small stream, the water so cold it made her teeth ache, and tried to wash some of the tar from her face and hands. But it clung to her like a second skin, refusing to come off completely. On what she thought was her second day in the wilderness, she heard voices. At first, she thought she might be hallucinating from hunger and exhaustion, but the sounds grew clearer as she crept closer. Men were talking, but not in English. The language was unfamiliar, with flowing sounds and rhythms unlike anything she had heard before. Fear gripped her as she realized she had stumbled into the territory of people she knew nothing about. Stories told in Cedar Ridge and other frontier towns painted all natives as savage and dangerous, ready to kill or capture any white person they encountered. But as she listened to the voices, they sounded calm, almost conversational. She tried to creep away without being detected, but her movement through the dry leaves was loud enough to alert whoever was nearby. The voices stopped abruptly, and she heard the sound of footsteps moving in her direction. Sarah's first instinct was to run, but she knew she didn't have the strength. The tar had cracked and split in dozens of places, and each movement sent sharp pains through her body. Instead, she crouched behind a large fallen log and tried to make herself as small as possible. The footsteps grew closer, and she could hear low voices speaking in that same unfamiliar language. Through gaps in the log, she caught glimpses of movement, men dressed in leather and fur, moving with a quiet confidence that spoke of people completely at home in the wilderness. One of them must have seen her, because the footsteps stopped just on the other side of her hiding place. Sarah held her breath and tried to remain perfectly still, but her body was shaking from cold and fear, making the feathers rustle against each other. A voice spoke directly above her, still in that unknown language, and she knew she had been discovered. Slowly, she raised her head above the log and found herself looking into the face of a man unlike any she had ever seen. He was older, maybe 50, with long gray hair braided with beads and feathers. His skin was dark and weathered, marked by decades of sun and wind. But it was his eyes that surprised her most. She had expected anger or hostility, but instead she saw something that looked almost like concern. Behind him stood two younger men, also dressed in leather and fur, carrying bows and wearing knives at their belts. They looked at her with expressions of amazement and confusion, speaking rapidly in their own language while gesturing at her strange appearance. The older man held up his hand for silence, then took a step closer to Sarah. She tried to shrink back, but there was nowhere to go. He spoke to her in heavily accented English, his voice gentle despite the strangeness of the situation. "You are hurt," he said, and it wasn't a question. His eyes took in the tar, the feathers, the obvious signs of abuse and exhaustion. "Who did this to you?" Sarah's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She had been expecting violence or capture, not kindness. The contrast was so stark that she couldn't process it. The man turned to his companions and spoke in their language. One of them disappeared back the way they had come, while the other began gathering dry wood for a fire. The older man remained where he was, studying Sarah with eyes that seemed to see much more than just her strange appearance. "I am Standing Bear," he said finally. "These are my sons, we will not hurt you." The name meant nothing to Sarah, but something in his manner convinced her that he was telling the truth. Slowly, she emerged from behind the log, revealing the full extent of her condition. The younger man who remained stopped gathering wood and stared at her, his expression shifting from confusion to anger. He spoke rapidly to his father, his voice rising with emotion. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the outrage in his tone. Standing Bear replied calmly but firmly, and the young man fell silent. "My son asks who would do such a thing to a woman," Standing Bear explained. "I tell him that some people's hearts are hard like stone, and they forget what it means to be human." The son who had left returned carrying a leather pouch and some strips of what looked like dried meat. Standing Bear took the pouch and approached Sarah slowly, his hands visible and empty of weapons. "This will help," he said, opening the pouch to reveal a dark, oily substance that smelled of pine and herbs. "It will soften the tar, make it easier to remove." Sarah wanted to tell him that she was fine, that she didn't need help, that she was capable of taking care of herself. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, tears began streaming down her face, cutting tracks through the tar and feathers that coated her cheeks. Standing Bear nodded as if he understood exactly what she was feeling. "Sit," he said gently. "Let us help you." She sank to the ground beside the fire his son had built, and for the first time in days she felt truly warm. The flames danced and crackled, casting moving shadows on the trees around them. It reminded her of evenings with her parents, sitting around their own fire, feeling safe and loved. Standing Bear began working on her hands first, applying his herbal mixture to soften the tar, then carefully peeling away layers of the hardened substance along with the feathers. It was slow, patient work, and he seemed to understand that every movement caused pain. "My people know about tar and feathers," he said as he worked. "White men used it on one of our traders many years ago when I was young. We learned then how to remove it without taking too much skin." The admission that his people had experience with this particular form of torture made Sarah look at him with new understanding. She wasn't the first person to suffer this way, and probably wouldn't be the last. but she might be one of the few to find help from someone who truly understood what she was going through. As Standing Bear worked, his sons fed the fire and prepared food. The smell of cooking meat made Sarah's stomach clench with hunger, reminding her of why she had stolen the bread in the first place. But she was afraid to ask for food, afraid to seem greedy or ungrateful when these strangers were already doing so much for her. Standing Bear seemed to read her thoughts. "When did you last eat?" he asked. 4 days ago, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Maybe 5. He spoke to his sons in their own language, and one of them immediately brought her a piece of the cooked meat, along with what looked like a cake made from ground berries and fat. Sarah ate slowly, afraid that her stomach might reject the food after so many days of emptiness. "What is your name?" Standing Bear asked as he continued working on her hands. "Sarah," she replied between small bites of food. "Sarah McKenna." "And who did this to you, Sarah McKenna?" The question brought back all the shame and humiliation of her punishment. She told him about the hunger, the desperation, the theft of the bread. She told him about the men of Cedar Ridge and their version of justice, about Crawford and his cold eyes, about the crowd that had watched her suffer without intervening. Standing Bear listened without judgment, his hands steady as he worked to free her from the tar that coated her arms. When she finished her story, he was quiet for a long moment. "You took bread because you were hungry," he said finally. "This is not a crime in the eyes of the Great Spirit. A hungry person should be fed, not punished." His words were simple, but they carried more healing power than all the herbal mixture he was applying to her skin. For the first time since her parents died, someone had looked at her situation and responded with understanding instead of condemnation. The work continued through the afternoon and into the evening. Standing Bear and his sons took turns, each bringing their own patience and skill to the task of removing the tar and feathers. They worked in sections, cleaning one area completely before moving to the next, always careful not to cause more damage than necessary. As they worked, Standing Bear told her about his people, the Lakota, and their way of life. He spoke of a world where sharing was not just encouraged but expected, where taking care of the hungry and homeless was a sacred duty, where justice was tempered with mercy and understanding. "In our way," he explained, "when someone does wrong, we ask why they did it. If they were hungry, we feed them. If they were cold, we give them warmth. If they were alone, we welcome them into our families. Punishment without understanding teaches nothing." By the time the moon rose full and bright above the trees, most of the tar had been removed from Sarah's body. Her skin was raw and tender in places, marked with patches where the tar had taken skin with it when it was removed. But she was clean again, recognizably human, no longer the grotesque creature she had been. Standing Bear's sons had withdrawn to the other side of the fire, giving her privacy as she washed in the stream and dressed in the clean clothes they had provided. The garments were made of soft leather and fur, warmer and more comfortable than anything she had worn in months. When she returned to the fire, Standing Bear studied her face in the firelight. "You are very young," he said, "too young to be wandering alone in the wilderness." "I have nowhere else to go," Sarah replied. "No family, no home. I've been on my own since my parents died." Standing Bear nodded thoughtfully. "Then perhaps the Great Spirit brought you to us for a reason. My wife lost a daughter to the fever last winter. She has been very sad with no one to teach the women's ways. You could come with us if you wish. Learn our ways, become part of our family." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Sarah couldn't immediately respond. These people had found her in the forest, a stranger covered in tar and feathers, and instead of turning away in disgust or fear, they had cleaned her wounds and offered her a home. "I don't know your language," she said finally. "I don't know your customs. I wouldn't know how to fit in." Standing Bear smiled, the first time she had seen him truly smile since they met. "Languages can be learned, customs can be taught. The heart, that is something you either have or you don't, and your heart, I think, is good." Sarah looked across the fire at the two young men who had helped clean the tar from her body, strangers who had shown her more kindness in one day than she had received from her own people in months. She thought of Cedar Ridge and its harsh justice, of the crowd that had watched her suffer, of the doors that had been closed to her when she begged for work. Then she thought of Standing Bear's words about sharing and understanding, about a way of life where caring for others was considered sacred. It sounded too good to be true, but the evidence was right in front of her. These people had already demonstrated their values through their actions. Yes, she said quietly. I would like to come with you. Standing Bear nodded with satisfaction. Good. We leave at dawn. It will take several days to reach our village and winter is coming quickly, but you will be warm there and safe and fed. As Sarah lay down that night wrapped in warm furs beside the dying fire, she thought about the strange path that had brought her to this place. A loaf of bread stolen in desperation had led to her worst nightmare, but somehow that nightmare had transformed into what felt like a miracle. She was still marked by her ordeal, her skin tender and scarred in places where the tar had been removed. But the deeper wounds, the ones to her spirit and her faith in human kindness, were already beginning to heal. Tomorrow she would start a new life with people who had shown her that mercy was still possible in a harsh world. For the first time in months, Sarah fell asleep feeling hopeful about the future. The journey to Standing Bear's village took 5 days through terrain that grew more beautiful and wild with each mile they traveled. Sarah rode behind one of Standing Bear's sons on a sturdy pony, marveling at how easily the animals navigated paths that seemed invisible to her untrained eyes. The men spoke softly among themselves in their musical language, occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife to each other. On the second day, they encountered a small herd of elk drinking from a mountain stream. Standing Bear held up his hand for silence, and they all stopped to watch the magnificent animals. Sarah had never seen elk before, and their size and grace took her breath away. When the animals finally moved on, Standing Bear turned to her with a slight smile. "They are our brothers," he explained. "All living things are connected. The elk, the trees, the streams, the rocks, even the white men who do cruel things. We are all part of the same great circle." The idea was so different from everything Sarah had been taught that she struggled to understand it. In her world, people were separate from animals, superior to them. Nature was something to be conquered and controlled, not respected and revered. But watching Standing Bear and his sons move through the wilderness with such confidence and reverence, she began to sense there might be wisdom in their approach. On the third day, they climbed higher into the mountains, following trails that switchbacked up steep slopes covered in pine and aspen trees. The air grew thinner and colder, but also cleaner and sweeter. Sarah found herself breathing deeply, feeling more alive than she had in months. That evening, as they made camp beside a small lake that reflected the stars like scattered diamonds, Standing Bear taught her some basic words in Lakota. The sounds were difficult for her tongue to shape, but he was patient with her efforts, correcting her gently when she mispronounced something. "Mitakui Oyasin," he said, pronouncing each syllable carefully. "It means all my relations. It reminds us that we are connected to everything and everyone." "Mitakui Oyasin," Sarah repeated, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. Standing Bear nodded approvingly. "Good. This is the most important thing to remember. When you understand this, everything else begins to make sense." On the fourth day, they encountered other members of Standing Bear's band, a hunting party returning to the village with fresh meat. The hunters greeted Standing Bear and his sons warmly, but their expressions grew puzzled when they saw Sarah. There was a rapid conversation in Lakota, with much gesturing and glancing in her direction. Sarah felt her old fears returning. What if these people didn't accept her the way Standing Bear had? What if they saw her as an outsider, an enemy, someone who couldn't be trusted? She had heard so many stories about Indians being hostile to whites that she couldn't help but worry. But Standing Bear seemed to be explaining her situation, his voice calm and authoritative. Gradually, the expressions of the hunting party softened, and several of them nodded with what looked like understanding. One of the younger men approached her and spoke a few words in broken English. "You are welcome," he said, his pronunciation careful but clear. "Standing Bear's family is our family." The simple acceptance in his voice brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She was beginning to understand that she had found something rare and precious, a community that judged people not by their race or their past mistakes, but by their character and their willingness to contribute to the common good. On the fifth day, they crested a ridge and saw the village spread out in the valley below. Sarah's breath caught in her throat at the beauty of the scene. Dozens of tipis arranged in a careful pattern, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing between the lodges, women working on various tasks while men tended to horses or repaired equipment. It looked peaceful and prosperous, a community where everyone had a place and a purpose. As they rode down into the valley, people began to emerge from their tipis to greet them. There were calls of welcome, laughter, and the sound of children running to meet the returning travelers. But Sarah also noticed something else in the faces that turned toward her. Curiosity, yes, but also a wariness that reminded her that she was still an outsider. Some of the looks she received were neutral, others seemed almost hostile. She realized that Standing Bear's acceptance didn't automatically extend to the entire community. Standing Bear must have sensed her discomfort because he leaned over to speak to her as they approached the center of the village. "Change is difficult for everyone," he said. "Some of our people have been hurt by white men. They will need time to see that you are different." They stopped in front of a large tipi decorated with painted symbols that Sarah didn't recognize. Standing Bear dismounted and helped her down from the pony, then called out in Lakota. A woman emerged from the tipi, and Sarah's first glimpse of Standing Bear's wife took her breath away. Gentle Moon was a woman of perhaps 40 years, with long black hair streaked with silver and eyes that seemed to hold depths of both sorrow and wisdom. She was dressed in a beautiful leather dress decorated with beadwork and quillwork, and she carried herself with a dignity that commanded respect. But when her eyes fell on Sarah, they filled with tears. She spoke rapidly to Standing Bear in Lakota, her voice choked with emotion. He responded gently, taking her hands and speaking in soothing tones. Sarah caught the word daughter in English and realized he was explaining his offer to her. Gentle Moon approached Sarah slowly, studying her face with intense concentration. She reached out hesitantly and touched Sarah's cheek, then spoke in halting English. "You are very young," she said, her voice soft but strong. "My daughter, she would be your age now if the fever had not taken her." Sarah didn't know what to say. How could she possibly fill the place of this woman's lost daughter? How could she even begin to understand the grief that Standing Bear and his wife carried? "I'm sorry for your loss," she said finally, the words seeming inadequate but heartfelt. Gentle Moon nodded, tears still shining in her eyes. "Standing Bear tells me you have lost your parents. We both know the pain of loss. Perhaps together we can help each other heal." The simple wisdom of her words touched something deep in Sarah's heart. She had been thinking of herself as a burden, someone who needed to be rescued and cared for. But Gentle Moon was suggesting something different, a mutual relationship where they could help each other deal with their grief. Over the following weeks, Sarah began to learn what it meant to be part of a Lakota community. The lessons started early each morning when Gentle Moon would take her to the river to wash and pray, greeting the dawn with words of gratitude for another day of life. Everything was different from the world Sarah had known. Instead of individual families struggling to survive on their own, the entire village worked together. Food was shared freely, with special attention paid to making sure the elderly, the widowed, and the children had enough to eat. No one went without while others had plenty. Work was organized along gender lines, but both men's and women's work was valued equally. Sarah learned to tan hides, to sew with sinew and bone needles, to gather roots and berries, to prepare pemmican for the winter months. The work was hard, but it was purposeful, and she was learning skills that would serve her for the rest of her life. Language was a constant challenge. Lakota was unlike English in its structure and sounds, and Sarah often frustrated herself trying to express complex thoughts with her limited vocabulary. But Gentle Moon was patient, and some of the younger people in the village had learned enough English to help translate when communication broke down completely. More challenging than language was learning to think in a completely different way. The Lakota worldview was based on connection and reciprocity rather than competition and individual achievement. Everything was seen as part of a larger whole, and decisions were made based on what was best for the entire community rather than what benefited any one person. Sarah struggled with concepts that seemed foreign to everything she had been taught. The idea that animals had spirits and deserved respect even when they were hunted for food. The belief that the land belonged to everyone and no one, that it couldn't be owned like a piece of property. The practice of giving away valuable possessions to show generosity rather than accumulating wealth. But gradually, as winter settled over the valley and she spent long evenings listening to the elders tell stories around the fires, she began to understand the wisdom in these beliefs. She saw how the community's emphasis on sharing and cooperation made everyone stronger and more secure. She watched how their respect for nature led to sustainable hunting and gathering practices that would ensure resources for future generations. The healing of her body from the tar and feathers had been relatively quick, but the healing of her spirit took much longer. For months after arriving in the village, Sarah woke up from nightmares about Cedar Ridge and the cruel faces of the men who had punished her. She would lie in the darkness of the tipi, her heart racing, until Gentle Moon's gentle breathing reminded her that she was safe now. But as winter progressed and her Lakota vocabulary grew, she began to share her story with other members of the community. She expected judgment, or at least incomprehension, but instead found understanding and acceptance. Many of them had their own stories of loss and hardship, their own experiences with the cruelty that people could inflict on each other. One evening, as snow fell softly outside the tipi and the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, Gentle Moon told Sarah about the death of her daughter. The girl had been 17, just 2 years younger than Sarah was now, and had died of pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. She was so full of life, Gentle Moon said, her voice thick with emotion. Always laughing, always asking questions about everything. She wanted to know why the sky was blue, why birds could fly but people couldn't, why some plants were good to eat and others were poison. Sarah listened without interrupting, understanding that this was a gift, a sharing of something precious and painful. When Gentle Moon finished, they sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own memories. "She would have liked you," Gentle Moon said finally. "You ask questions the same way she did, always trying to understand not just what but why." It was the highest compliment Sarah had ever received, and it marked a turning point in her relationship with her adoptive mother. From that night forward, she felt truly accepted, not just as a replacement for the daughter who had died, but as herself, with her own unique gifts and challenges. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought a transformation that seemed to mirror Sarah's own journey. The snow melted to reveal bright green grass and wildflowers. The streams ran full and clear with snowmelt. The air filled with the songs of returning birds and the sounds of new life being born. Sarah had been with the Lakota for almost a year now, and the woman who emerged into the spring sunshine was vastly different from the desperate, frightened girl who had stolen bread in Cedar Ridge. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her place in the world. Her hands were skilled from months of working with leather and beadwork. Her mind was filled with stories and songs in a language that had become as natural to her as English. But perhaps most importantly, her heart had healed from the trauma she had experienced. The nightmares had stopped. The crushing sense of shame and worthlessness had been replaced by a quiet pride in what she had learned and accomplished. She knew now that her value as a person wasn't determined by her worst moment, but by how she chose to live each day. One warm afternoon in early summer, Sarah was working outside the tipi, sewing beadwork on a new dress, when a commotion arose at the edge of the village. Riders were approaching, white men by their appearance, and the entire community was stirring with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Standing Bear emerged from his tipi, his face serious as he watched the approaching party. Sarah recognized the look, the careful alertness that came over the men of the village whenever outsiders appeared. Too often, visits from white men brought trouble in one form or another. The party consisted of 5 men, all armed and travel-worn. Their leader was a tall man with a badge pinned to his vest, and Sarah's heart began to race as she recognized him as a territorial marshal. Behind him rode 4 deputies, their hands resting casually but meaningfully on their weapons. The marshal called out a greeting in English, his voice carrying across the camp. "I'm looking for Chief Standing Bear. Got some business to discuss with him." Standing Bear walked forward to meet them, his posture dignified but cautious. "I am Standing Bear. What brings you to our village?" The marshal dismounted and approached, his movements deliberate and official. "Marshal James Morrison, Territorial Government. I've got a warrant for the arrest of a white woman, name of Sarah McKenna. Information says she might be staying with your people." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Somehow, someone from Cedar Ridge had tracked her here. After almost a year of peace and safety, her past had finally caught up with her. Standing Bear's expression didn't change, but Sarah could see the slight tensing of his shoulders that indicated he was preparing for trouble. "What crime is this woman accused of?" "Theft," the marshal replied. "Also destruction of property and disturbing the peace. The folks in Cedar Ridge want her brought back to face proper justice." Sarah wanted to run, to hide, to somehow escape back into the wilderness where she had found safety before. But she knew it was useless. There was nowhere to run where they wouldn't eventually find her, and running would only bring trouble to the people who had given her sanctuary. Instead, she stood up slowly and walked toward the group of men. "I'm Sarah McKenna," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that was coursing through her. The marshal looked surprised to see her step forward voluntarily. His deputies shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable to be surrounded by so many armed Lakota warriors who were watching the proceedings with intense interest. "Sarah McKenna," the marshal said, "you're under arrest for theft and related charges. You need to come with us back to Cedar Ridge to stand trial." "No," Standing Bear said quietly, but his voice carried absolute authority. "This woman is under the protection of the Lakota people. She has committed no crime here." The marshal's hand moved toward his gun, and instantly the atmosphere grew charged with tension. Lakota men began moving closer, their own weapons suddenly more visible. What had started as a simple arrest was threatening to become something much more dangerous. "Now see here," the marshal said, trying to maintain his official tone while clearly aware of how badly outnumbered he was. "I've got legal authority here. This woman is wanted for crimes committed in United States territory." "Your authority ends where our sovereignty begins," Standing Bear replied. "Sarah McKenna is now Lakota. What she did before she came to us is no longer your concern." Sarah realized that Standing Bear was prepared to risk conflict with the territorial government to protect her. The thought filled her with gratitude, but also with terror. She couldn't let these people suffer for her sake, couldn't let her presence bring violence to the community that had given her so much. "It's all right," she said, stepping between Standing Bear and the marshal. "I'll go with them." "No," Gentle Moon's voice rang out across the camp as she hurried toward them. "You are my daughter now. You belong with us." The marshal looked confused by this turn of events. Clearly, he had expected to simply ride into the village, collect his prisoner, and leave. He hadn't anticipated that the Lakota would claim Sarah as one of their own or be willing to defy territorial authority to protect her. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she looked around at the faces of the people who had become her family. In their eyes, she saw acceptance, determination, and a willingness to fight for her that took her breath away. But she also knew what that fight would cost them. Relations between the Lakota and the territorial government were always tense, balanced on a knife's edge between peace and war. Her presence here could tip that balance in a direction that would bring suffering to innocent people. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," she said to Standing Bear, speaking in Lakota so the marshal wouldn't understand. "But I won't let you risk war for me. These people have families, children. I won't be responsible for their deaths." Standing Bear's eyes flashed with something that might have been pride. "You speak like true Lakota," he replied in the same language. "Always thinking of the good of the people before yourself. But you are wrong about one thing. You are not responsible for the actions of cruel men. You are only responsible for your own choices." The conversation in Lakota was making the marshal nervous. "English," he demanded. "Speak English so we can all understand what's being discussed." Sarah turned to face him, and for a moment she saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of her, but fear of the situation he had walked into. Fear of the proud, determined people who surrounded him. Fear of the consequences if this encounter went wrong. "Marshal," she said, her voice calm and clear, "I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. A year ago, I was starving. I stole a loaf of bread to keep from dying. For that crime, the people of Cedar Ridge tarred and feathered me and drove me into the wilderness to die." The marshal's deputies shifted uncomfortably at her words. Tar and feathers was an extreme punishment, even by frontier standards, and the fact that it had been applied to a starving young woman made it seem particularly harsh. "But I didn't die," Sarah continued. "I was found by these people who cleaned my wounds, fed me, and gave me a home. They showed me more mercy in one day than my own people showed me in months of begging for help." She gestured around at the village, at the people who had gathered to witness this confrontation. "Look around you, Marshal. Do you see enemies of the United States? Or do you see people who understand justice better than the men who sent you here?" The marshal was clearly struggling with the situation. His legal authority was clear, but the moral complexity of what he was being asked to do was equally obvious. He had come here expecting to arrest a simple thief, not to drag a young woman away from people who had shown her genuine kindness. "The law is the law," he said finally, but there was less conviction in his voice than before. "Whose law?" Standing Bear asked. "The law that says a hungry person should be punished instead of fed, The law that says it's acceptable to torture a young woman for trying to survive. If that is your law, then we reject it. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with neither side willing to back down. Sarah could see that the marshal was trying to find a way out of the situation that would allow him to maintain his authority without starting a conflict he couldn't win. Finally, she made the choice for him. "I'll make you a deal, Marshal," she said. "I'll come with you willingly without resistance if you'll allow me to say goodbye to my family properly." The marshal considered this offer, clearly relieved to have found a way forward that didn't involve forcing his way through a hostile crowd. "You've got 1 hour," he said. "Then we leave." Sarah nodded and turned to face the people who had become her world. Gentle Moon was crying openly now, and even Standing Bear's stoic expression was cracked with emotion. She went to each of them in turn, embracing them, speaking words of gratitude and love in the Lakota language that had become as natural to her as breathing. When she came to Standing Bear, he took her hands in his and looked directly into her eyes. "You are Lakota now and forever," he said. "No matter where you go or what happens to you, remember that you have a family here who loves you." "Mitakui Oyasin," Sarah replied, using the phrase he had taught her on their journey to the village. "All my relations." Standing Bear smiled through his tears. "You understand now, you truly understand." As she prepared to leave with the marshal and his men, Sarah realized that her year with the Lakota had given her something more valuable than safety or comfort. It had given her a new understanding of what it meant to be human, what it meant to belong to a community, what it meant to treat others with dignity and respect regardless of their circumstances. The men of Cedar Ridge had tried to mark her permanently as a thief and an outcast, but the Lakota had shown her that she could choose her own identity, that she could be defined by her actions going forward rather than by her worst moment. As they rode away from the village, Sarah held her head high. She was still afraid of what awaited her in Cedar Ridge, but she was no longer the desperate, friendless girl who had stolen bread a year ago. She was Lakota now, part of a family and a tradition that valued courage and dignity above all else. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the strength and wisdom her adoptive people had given her. And someday, somehow, she would find a way to return to the place where she had learned the true meaning of justice and mercy. The mountains grew smaller behind them as they rode east, but Sarah carried their lessons in her heart. She had been saved not just from the tar and feathers, but from despair itself, and that salvation would stay with her no matter where the road ahead might lead.